Okay, welcome to our event. Thank you so much for being here. We're grateful for all of you, and we're especially thankful for the opportunity to host Professor John Inazu. This, if you didn't pick up on it from any of the advertisements, is a kind of a celebration for the launch of his latest book, Learning to Disagree. And it just launched officially yesterday, so I'm thrilled to have him here the day after the launch to be able to celebrate this new book. Why we are here? Why are we doing this? Well, the First Amendment Center here at the University of Texas, the Bech-Loughlin First Amendment Center, aims to be the leading academic hub of its kind in the United States. And our mission is to promote knowledge of the freedoms of the First Amendment, as well as to foster an appreciation of those freedoms in our legal system. And of course, those freedoms include the freedoms of religion, speech, and the press, as well as the right to peacefully assemble and petition the government. There's a problem, though, that if we don't know how to use those freedoms and use them well, they become relatively meaningless very quickly. And we actually face some significant challenges in our society today in the United States for using the freedoms of the First Amendment and using them well. I don't know if you all fully understand what's happening behind the scenes. Probably many of you do, but I think some of us don't. What's happening behind the scenes with all of the smartphones and social media we're using. You know, if you go back and watch movies or stories about trying to land people on the moon or get the Apollo 13 spacecraft back, you'll often see rooms of scientists all working together on complex mathematics, trying to solve problems, and when they solve those problems, they cheer, and it's a big room of people all working on it. Now imagine all of those same people, but with the singular goal of getting you addicted to whatever product they're creating on their smartphones and through social media. And that is not an exaggeration, that is an accurate picture of how most tech companies operate today, with teams of mathematicians and computer scientists setting as a goal to get you addicted. And one of the ways they know they can get you addicted is by getting you angry at things and getting you angry at other people and ratcheting up your fear of other people. So we have that happening. We simultaneously have foreign actors from various countries around the world who have realized that America is the most diverse population religiously, racially, culturally of any country in the world, and that they can use that diversity against us by doing the same thing. So using AI and bots, they actually have intentionally set out to use social media to put Americans at each other's throats and to divide us and weaken us politically. It makes it very, very difficult to use all these freedoms we have if we are constantly in a state of thinking we're surrounded by enemies, and sadly, that's where we're at. And that's why I'm so thrilled for Professor Inazu's new book, because it's the beginning step for each of us of learning how to overcome all of those challenges and not allow ourselves to be manipulated into thinking that every human being with whom we disagree must be our enemy and must be a monster that we have to attack. And I'm thrilled to be able to hear from him and to be able to explore his book. So the way we're going to do this today, and by the way, I'll encourage each of you to buy it. It is available now on Amazon. And one thing that's great about all those mathematicians and scientists using our smartphones against us is they have figured out how you can literally get on your phone right now and click buy, and it'll be at your doorstep tomorrow. Okay? So I'll happy to sell his books for him. The way we're going to do this is we're going to, I'm going to introduce a panel of students, each from very different backgrounds. It sounds like the beginning of a joke, but we have a Christian, an atheist, and a Muslim up here. And each of them are going to talk about how they felt Professor Inazu's book helped them, how it helped them approach talking with people with whom they disagree. They'll each kind of share their thoughts. They may even have critiques of the book where they feel like it may not be as helpful. And then Professor Inazu will come up and lead a discussion, and then we'll have time for a Q&A after that. So let me introduce everyone, and then I will get out of the way. First off, we have Reem Sheikh. She told me the actual pronunciation. I can't do it. So Reem is a PhD student in the Department of Middle Eastern Studies. She specializes in Islamic studies with a focus on the history of Islamic law and the application of Islamic law in the modern context. Alex Nutt, in the middle, is a third-year law student and president of the UT Christian Legal Society. A Christian first and a law student second, he's going to work at the Harris County DA's office in Houston after the bar, where he hopes he'll be able to put all of the mostly civil disagreements of the law school to good use. And finally, we have Clayton Dana, is it Basham? Basham. He is a second-year law student here at UT. He is an editor on the Texas Law Review and is the editor-in-chief of the Texas Journal on Civil Liberties, and civil rights, and was also in our law and religion clinic where he excelled on all sorts of levels. And finally, our guest of honor is Professor John Inazu, who is the Sally D. Danforth Distinguished Professor of Law and Religion and Professor of Political Science at Washington University in St. Louis. His scholarship focuses on the First Amendment freedoms of speech, assembly and religion, and related questions of legal and political theory. His books include Liberty's Refuge, The Forgotten Freedom of Assembly from Yale University Press, and Confident Pluralism, Surviving and Thriving Through Deep Differences from the University of Chicago Press. He is also, incidentally, one of the leading First Amendment scholars in the country and on our First Amendment Center's Board of Advisors. So we are just thrilled to have him here. He is an important voice on helping us all overcome what I think is an often manufactured polarization in the United States today. So with that, please welcome our panelist and Professor Inazu. Project your voices, guys.
I'll try my best. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me here at the law school. It's my first time coming to this building. It's a fun experience to see how nice you guys have it on this side of the campus. So when I started reading this book, I think I had a very different idea of what to expect in this book. I thought I would be reading a book about a lot of personal disagreements, and I think the book talks a lot about disagreements within the context of being in law school. So it was like I was learning two things at the same time. One was, learning how to disagree, but at the same time learning basically how law classes work. And the entire time, I think, in my mind, I was trying to translate how I would apply these, situations or circumstances that happen in law classes to my own life. And I felt like it was very useful being able to interpret that myself because I came up with ideas about my own personal situations. So Professor Inazu starts out in the book by talking about how a lot of people just try to avoid topics of disagreements because, a lot of people think everyone is too complicated, politics are too complicated, it's just better to keep it to small talk, to ideas that aren't that uncomfortable. And I agree, it is true that people are complicated, but I think this should be a way for us to be encouraged to try and understand what is it that makes this person in front of me a complex person instead of just a simple, like a simple being. So with those thoughts in mind, there were two main points that Professor Inazu made that I felt like related to my own beliefs and my own faith. And the first one is when he says that in order for us to be fair to each other, we have to understand that fairness reflects not only people's actions but also their motives and intentions. And I thought this to be very, stood out to me because one of the main tenets in Islam is that all actions are judged by intentions, right? So no action is basically either by God's judgment or even by human judgment. We're supposed to know what are the motives, what are the reasons behind people's actions. So I found this to be very interesting because sometimes we forget to use that in our own personal experiences. We're thinking about, cases of law, or we're thinking about the bigger picture rather than, oh, why is this person speaking to me in a way that's a little off-putting, or why is this person giving me the cold shoulder, or why is this person not responding to my text? And I started thinking about that, like, we have to understand that people are much more complex than just what they do or what we see in front of us. And whether this comes to disagreements in personal issues or even disagreements between people of my faith or disagreements between myself and people of other faiths, understand that just what they say or what they do does not give the full picture of what is meant behind it or what their intentions or motives may be. The other thing that I found really interesting, and I think it's kind of almost similar, is that we need to distinguish people from the ideas that they have. So someone may have an idea that we disagree with or we don't like, but that doesn't define the person entirely. They can have, again, their motives, or they can have a reason to why they think a certain way, and we need to look at the person separately sometimes from the ideas. We may disagree with the idea and not like the idea, or even find the idea to be repulsive, but that shouldn't basically reflect on what we think of the person. And this also goes back to certain things I think about in what we're taught in Islamic tenets, is that number one, we're taught how to treat people kindly, and we're taught in a saying by the Prophet Muhammad, we're taught that whenever you talk to a person, you should give that person 70 excuses. that means you're thinking about 70 motives or 70 reasons behind why they could have done something or why they did something before you come to the bad idea or the bad reason or the bad thing that comes out. And another thing that we find in the Holy Book, in the Holy Quran, is that God says is, if you speak good, say good things. So I think this all comes back in a full circle. Both these main points is that a lot of this comes that it doesn't have to be as complex as the ideas or as complex as the people. It should be as simple as just, thinking of people fairly, being kind, and then giving people excuses, whether it's one excuse or 70 excuses, and keeping your speech to good speech. And I think Professor Inazu's way of representing that in the book and explaining it in a way that was both technical and personal made it very easy to understand and apply in my own thinking.
I think I am the atheist on the panel, for those who couldn't have guessed. And although I don't have any religious beliefs now, I grew up in a Christian household like many people in Texas do. And one of the things that I realized as I was growing up and discovering that I did not in fact believe in a higher power, I felt a replacement of the faith that comes with religiosity with a certainty that I was right, that religion was wrong. And one of the things that I have been very grateful for in working with the Law and Religion Clinic this year, and that I think Professor Inazu talks about really well in his book, is that that sort of certainty, no matter what you believe, is a mistake and is a barrier to speaking with people across disagreement. When Reem is talking, a lot of what Reem is talking about and the connections to the Quran, I feel no connection to the Quran at all, in the same way that when we were talking at breakfast this morning with Professor Inazu, I didn't necessarily feel connection to some of the biblical references that we were discussing at breakfast time. But what I did feel a connection to was the principles and the ideas underlying the religious beliefs or the quotes from the holy books. And I think it is important, and what Professor Inazu talks a lot about in this book is empathy and being able to understand, as Reem said, people and not just their ideas and where things are drawn from. And something that I think is important in learning how to disagree with people is empathy and also humility, and to recognize that even if you are certain that somebody else is wrong, that doesn't mean that you are right. And even if you are certain that you are right, doesn't mean that other people are wrong. And most importantly, how ideas are packaged is not nearly as important as what those ideas are. I don't disagree with anything that Reem said, even though it's drawn from the Quran. I feel a lot of those same tenets, I just don't draw them from a religious background. And I think the way that Professor Inazu talks about decentering yourself in your own religious beliefs and centering other people in their humanity is valuable to getting beyond the rage and the anger that a lot of us feel at other people because of their ideas.
Yep, absolutely. So something I think that Professor Inazu does excellently in this book, and I do highly recommend it to you all, is that it is not a political book, nor is it really a religious book. There are political points that are raised in here where I was nodding along and saying, yes, absolutely, and political points where I was shaking my head and saying, how can you put this down here? But I think that means that a good balance was struck. And something too, I think that's key to the structure of this is that it is so tied up in the stories of others and in your own experiences, because those are the ways in which we relate to people the most. Those are the things that at the end are most important. And they're not necessarily unique to any system of beliefs, be it lack of a faith in a higher power, be it the Bible, be it the Quran, or other faiths that I don't have time to go into the exhaustive list. But so in Christianity at least, there's the idea of the Holy Spirit, the idea of the divinity of each person. Also to your point about 70 answers, or 70 excuses, forgive me. There's a point in the Gospels at which Jesus is asked, well, how many times should we forgive someone who does us wrong? And should we forgive them 7 times? And there are some argument about the numbers, but essentially what Jesus responds with is, truly I tell you, it should be 7 times 70 times, ad infinitum. The thing that you are forgiving is that person. It's not necessarily the wrong ideas or the things which you butt up against one another. It's the actual experiences that underlie these disagreements. And I think that when we silo into our own beliefs too much, we lose sight of that goodness within each person. So it's easy for people to assume, and I know that some do, that, well, okay, atheists all are just completely amoral monsters, they believe in nothing whatsoever, everything is terrible, but I know from experience that that's not true. And the same for Muslims. People who don't know enough about others, because they don't engage in these disagreements and these discussions, actually don't get the chance to find the things that are most important about each other. And I think that's probably the reason why the temperature is rising in a lot of these modern discussions, because we are not actually discussing the fundamental ideas from a position of charity with each other. So I think this is a good roadmap, no matter where you fall politically or religiously.
One thing that I do want to mention, particularly because this is the law school and there are a lot of law students in here, Professor Inazu talks about how we in law school doing the practice of law want there to be hard, solid, correct answers to things. And one of the pieces that he brings up sort of ancillarily in the book is, what do you do about armrests on an airplane? Right? There's the window seat, the middle seat, and the aisle seat. Who gets the armrests and how do you decide? And I think something that is important that we do in law school is the question of how do we decide that? What is the right principle? What is the correct way to handle the majority of cases where who decides who gets the armrests? And I read that passage and my first response is, well, the other person gets the armrest. Because my personal belief is every time, I don't need that armrest as much as the other person might need to. I don't have a categorical rule for that. I don't have a solid principle that could be rooted in history and tradition or the text of the rules of airplane law or what have you. It's just something that is intuitively the right thing for me to do. And I think that in law school, all too often we are taught to set aside our intuitions about how we want things to be in service of the correct principle or the right answer or the best way for things to be set up. And one of the things that I appreciate about Dr. Inazu's book is he really resists that temptation of categorizing everything and finding the underlying principle, and instead, as we've said, is much more focused on empathy and intuition and creating the type of communities and discourse that we want to see in the world.
And it's interesting in the book too, because there's it feels very human, because at some points Professor Inazu does categorize something, and then you see the process of where he goes through correcting himself and being like, oh, I did that, this is how I'm going to correct this categorization. And on the point of empathy, I really appreciated Professor Inazu's point about social media, and I think that's very important, especially with our generation, is that social media highly creates a space where there is no space for empathy. Depersonalizes people, or makes people very abstract, where you don't realize you're talking to another human who also has motives and who also has beliefs and ideas, and very easy to just type out a lot of words and say a lot of things that we disagree with, and it's very easy to forget who we're talking to and what we're discussing.
That's good.
All right, yeah.
Where does it say that?
Thank you. That was awesome. And thanks for being here. Sandra, thanks for organizing, and thanks for calling us, and Professor Laycock, great to see you. This was great, and I've got lots of things to riff on from what was just said, but I want to start with armrest, because I just flew down here, and in addition to armrest, there's the seat back problem, right? And the guy in front of me on my flight down just went right back. And I was thinking about that because I wrote about that in this book, and I spend my time kind of pushing up, trying to annoy him. So part of the answer there is this is a book about me as a work in progress too. I don't have it all figured out. I am short-tempered and impatient a lot. But the armrests and the seat backs, and the other point I make in the book along those lines is the tension between people with allergies and people with pets, all of whom want to fly. I'm someone with severe allergies, and so when the little dog ends up next to me on the airplane, that materially affects my life. But the airlines have decided that the little dog gets to be there. And why is that? So whether it's armrests or seat backs or pets, these questions of baselines about what's fair and who decides, and of course those of you studying law here, this is what you do. day in and day out, and you realize that these baselines are normatively contested all the time. It's not like there's some, in many of these cases, there's not some cosmically right answer about who gets to lean back or not, but we make allocations and judgments and then we argue about them. And I think the remarkable thing here is that we argue about them, relatively speaking, in a situation, in an environment of peace and order. It doesn't mean there's not politics, it doesn't mean there's not games, it doesn't mean there's not bad actors, but we are a law-governed society, and at the end of the day, I lose my preferences when it comes to allergies and dogs on planes, and I still go about my life that way. And so what I love about being here and actually starting in this way, and thanks to all of you for those comments, is this illustrates the messiness of what we're doing, the collective enterprise of learning and doing law and education more broadly. And we've just proven that we can do this in an actual embodied and civilized way. This started to sound a little bit like a mutual affirmation panel, right? Like, we love what you're saying. So that illustrates there's deep common ground and there's deep shared humanity. And yet, if we made the room a little smaller and extended the time a few hours, we would quickly get to some very deep and painful differences. Irreconcilable, incommensurable, and those differences are not just what flavor of ice cream do you like. Those differences are, we believe differently about the nature of the created order, what happens when you die, what makes you a good person. Maybe ancillary to that, we have deeply held policy preferences that we want enacted into law, and the consequence of those policies will be favorable to our team and less favorable to someone else. And more broadly, those of you studying here are working toward those ends. And I don't know you and what motivates you, but I would assume in a room like this that some of you are hoping to be very successful lawyers on very opposite sides of important issues. And you're going to hope that your training from UT Law prepares you to prevail and win, and for your adversary to lose. And I think there's a real, actually important model just to name in the doing of that together. I mean, I teach law too. This isn't a cakewalk. Yes, there are protests sometimes, and there are people who are unsettled, and law school is very frustrating for some people. But by and large, year in and year out, we pull it off, right? And you come here and you get indoctrinated in your first year, and a couple years later, you're graduating and you're practicing law. And it's pretty amazing that in a society as diverse as ours, with especially growing ideological fractures and divides, that we're able to make that happen. So part of this gets me sort of to why this book, why did I do this? This is not much of an academic book in the traditional sense of writing about my core First Amendment expertise, but this is more trying to blend what I've learned in scholarship and research, but also what I've learned through teaching. So I take the reader through essentially a year of teaching law school, through the classes that I teach, which are principally criminal law and law and religion. And the great thing about those classes is they set up just an incredible range of cases and issues, and most people, especially when it comes to law and religion, have skin in the game, right? You believe something or you don't believe something, but you care about these cases and you care about how they come out. And then in criminal law, similarly, you have intuitions and views, about the way a defendant is treated, the way a victim is treated. And part of the challenge, but really the privilege too, of teaching courses like that is you have to hold in tension this professionalism and the skills we're teaching you with the humanity and the person that you are. So not to give up on who you are or the values that you bring or the emotions that you feel, but also to recognize at the end of the day, we're not interested in your personal opinion about what the law or the doctrine says. We want you to be able to learn skills and tools to argue well for your position. And that also means, it's funny, I've been doing a bunch of radio shows and podcasts around this book, and it turns out I'd kind of forgotten that most people don't like lawyers. And most people, start by thinking lawyers are those people who argue all the time and who just are stubborn to the core. And I realized that is true of some lawyers, and especially bad lawyers. But really good lawyers are the lawyers that get paid the big bucks and that go to places like this school and my school are the kind of lawyers who know how to do a deep dive into the other side of the argument, how to step into that person's shoes, understand the best possible case, why the authority might cut in their direction, think of counter arguments. And one of the points I try to make is, you might be doing that for very prudential or pragmatic reasons. You're doing that because you're spending all this time on the other person's argument because you want to win. I get that. And yet, the very work of doing that is a work of empathy. You can't actually fully understand at a very high level the other side's argument without getting a little bit of empathy into what's motivating them and what they're doing. And then when you turn to a judge or a decision maker or some other authority figure, you have to present that in a way that's going to be persuasive to them. And that's usually not, I'm awesome, he's an idiot. It's usually, this is a hard case, but let me tell you why my position should prevail here. And that's what really good lawyering is. And so the pitch I make here is, this is important, obviously, for people thinking about studying and practicing law, but it's also important for all the people who aren't going to go to law school, because this is the kind of stuff that you also need around the Thanksgiving dinner table and the neighborhood picnic and the workplace, and how, as we're all kind of feeling the weight and tension of this coming election season especially, how do we prepare to engage with the people around us? How do we figure out what disagreement looks like, not just in the next few months, but in the years to come? And I'm hoping that this can be sort of part of that conversation, with the spoiler alert that there's not like, this is not 10 points to better arguments or anything like that. There's no checklist or shortcut. And what I'm trying to do here is to say, hopefully, and I'd love for you to respond in a minute if this worked or not, but my goal is to, as you read this book, for you to kind of start to feel a mode or a way of engaging, and then think, how do I do or not do this, and how might I think about it differently? But definitely not a checklist. And the reason for this is that the kinds of civic postures that we need increasingly in this society don't happen overnight, right? And the malformations that we're seeing unfold all around us, and this might be, your family and friends. It could be you. It could be people on social media. This didn't happen like last week. This happened over years and years of malformation and the kinds of practices that lead us to impatience and quick dismissals and caricatures and echo chambers and all of that. And if we think we're going to kind of unring that bell in a month or even before November, we're kidding ourselves, right? We've got to play a much longer game here and start to think about, what does repairing the social fabric look like in the long term without sacrificing principles or convictions or the reality of our differences. So with that, I'm curious if the kind of the goal of modeling rather than preaching, if that came across, and anything else in what I said that hits you there.
I actually have a very specific story on that point, and it not being a book that is a checklist to better argument. At one point in the book, Professor Inazu, you talk about one of your parents' cancer diagnoses and handling that. My father died unexpectedly a few years ago, and when I read that passage, I had a very deep moment of empathy with you, but also with myself, because this is a book about having better discussions with people, not having better disagreements. And I wrote, what does it say about me that I'm still convinced I could change my dad's mind on a topic? There was a conversation that we were in the middle of, extended over months, that we never got to resolve because he died in the middle of it. And to this day, like sitting in this chair right now, I am utterly convinced that if I could have had one more conversation, I would have changed his mind about it. But that's not good debate or discussion or disagreement. That is me being calcified in my position and using my father's memory as sort of a totem for aggrandizing to myself this ability to change somebody's mind. And when I read how you thought about that diagnosis and caring for your parent, I realized I need to have more empathy, not just with my father and his memory, but with myself, for how I want to engage in those sorts of conversations. Because yes, it is a regret of mine that I didn't get to change his mind, but there are a lot bigger and more important things that I miss and regret about not having further conversations with my dad, and it's not that he was opposed to Obamacare when he died. It's things like, it is moments like that that happen more than once in this book that I think make it a lot more useful than point 1, point 2, point 3, here's how you change everybody's mind.
So I think that does tie in to sort of the general theme of faith. And I'm not saying you need to follow one of the specific religions to have faith. We all have faith in something. But faith is fundamentally something that lies at the center of your own heart. You can't force someone else to have faith. It's fundamentally antithetical to what it is. The only way you can actually end up changing someone's position is by engaging with them and then trying to present your arguments persuasively if you think it's important. And we are talking about things that we consider to be of vital importance, but it's important to look for the person underneath that, the person who has gone through things that you have no idea about, life experiences that you could never understand without having lived through those things. And that applies to not only everyone in this room, but also back through history. Even people with views who we would look back on and say, were you to hold those views today, well, you're just out of the political discourse, you can't have those views. But they were people just the same as we are. And they believed the things they did, often for very important reasons. We can't change their minds, but we shouldn't write off anyone's beliefs in past or present just because they happen to have some beliefs that we vehemently disagree with.
Interesting, I read the book when I did because just the previous day I had a disagreement with a friend who was going through something very difficult. And in a moment where I felt like I was advocating for this friend and trying to help her out, she disagreed with my method. And I felt like afterwards my entire focus became on, I'm right, I know what I did was right, instead of, oh, she's going through something very difficult, and why does she feel the way she feels in this moment? So I had to do this thing where I put myself in her shoes through, my husband's advice and multiple people telling me. I had to figure out how to put myself in her shoes and think, oh, she's felt, this way by this person and that person, and all those have led up to this moment where she feels this way about what I have said to her. So it doesn't matter in that moment. Sometimes it doesn't matter whether I'm wrong or right, but why is the person feeling the way they feel, and how can I be there for them in that way?
Yeah, so I feel like a lot of what I'm trying to get at in this book feels like the stuff we learned in kindergarten, not in the third year of law school, but it's also the hardest stuff to put into practice sometimes. And sometimes, to Clayton's example, it can be a very jarring. And my dad and I had a argument over politics. We stopped talking for a year, and then when I got the call that he had stage 4 cancer, it was time to start talking again. And so sometimes it's that kind of a jarring moment. Other times it's less clear and we need to pay more attention to context. So one of the stories that I talk about in this book, and writing this book was a fun experience for me because as I was writing it, I already knew mostly what I was trying to say, but I was also still living life. And so I would, like my airplane experience, I would write something in the morning and then go out into the world and totally screw up and think, well, here's another good example of that. So I got sued by my neighborhood association. It's a ridiculous claim about the back of my yard. And it's just caused an extraordinary amount of time, and I eventually had to hire a lawyer, which, by the way, you all know, like, if you ever get sued, don't represent yourself. And I'm in this process, I have to trek down to the county records office to find some easement from over 100 years ago. And it turns out, as I narrate in the book, this is a multi-day process that is not made easy by the St. Louis County Records Office. And I'm just increasingly frustrated moving from line to line. And at the end of the day, I finally have the notice that the easements are going to be copied for me, and so I walk up there, and around the corner, the woman who works in the office just comes up to me, huge smile on her face. She said, I just want you to know, I found these for you. This particular copy was smudged, so I found a different source for it, and I've laid them out. I really hope they're helpful. My job is to make your job easier, and I love what I do. And it was just this extraordinary moment of grace from this woman who I had no idea she was. She didn't know me. She could have just easily seen me as a problem at the end of her day, but she took the time to validate me as a person. And I paused, and I think I wrote this in the book too. What if she'd been having a bad day, right? Or what if she'd come in there just off a fight with her spouse or something and hadn't smiled in the same way? How would I have responded differently? Would I have cued off of that in a different way, or might I instead try to work toward being kind, not seeing the people I encounter as simply problems. And it led me to reflect a bit in the book about how often this happens in the law. One of the exercises that I have my first year criminal law students do is visit a criminal court proceeding. And I by design give them 0 instructions, and it just terrifies them, right? It's 1L, they don't know what they're doing. They ask me, like, where should I park, or what do I have to wear? And I said, I'm not telling you anything, you have to figure it out. And then I make them write a little reflection about it, and almost every time this works, and people are actually, they hate doing it, but they're very grateful to have done it. And part of that is recognizing how strange and unfamiliar and anxiety producing that experience can be. And my students are going as a training exercise, but most of the other people walking through that building are defendants or family members or victims or witnesses who are just as terrified, just as unsure about what's going on. And then they're encountering the civil servants who work there, and sometimes they're dismissive and treating them poorly. And so I think just to recognize we're all fighting a great battle. We don't know what's happening with the person across from us, whether it's our debate partner over a period of months or the person at the records office we see for 5 minutes, but how we engage with them can really reflect a lot about our humanity and theirs.
I do have one small quibble with something that you said real early on in that, which is you said in some ways this feels like a book about the things that we learned in kindergarten. I think it is better to describe it as a book about the things that we forget once we leave kindergarten.
I like that, yeah. Everyone needs to buy a copy to remember. Yeah, no, I think that's right. And our own habits and dispositions do not help reinforce the basics in this way. I mean, I was thinking a lot, and I'm sure many of you are too, just about how social media engagement pushes us in such a poor direction when it comes to trying, especially across complex disagreement with other people, because at best we're reducing the other side to these one-dimensional caricatures, and we don't. When you can get out of that context, and this is one of the things I talk about, is when you can find a space to have an actual conversation and just let the surrounding ordinary stuff fill in a bit, you have a much better shot of working through disagreement. It doesn't mean you're going to like the person at the end of the day, and this is also important, it doesn't mean that you reduce the significance or your commitment to what you care about. One of the things, I do some work on interfaith activities around these kinds of issues too, and one of the things that kind of frustrates me about the 1990s interfaith movement is it was sort of rooted in this kumbaya, let's all hold hands and pretend that the disagreements didn't matter. And it floundered because when you got to actual religious people, the differences mattered tremendously, right? I mean, the practices that they were committed to, the barriers to some forms of relationship that those differences created, they mattered a great deal. And when you're clear about what your differences are, then you can actually be more generous across them. It's when you're kind of obfuscating or pretending that we all agree on stuff that this sort of soupy middle ground doesn't work out and tensions build. So kind of having a clarity about your own beliefs, and then and recognizing that these are over things that matter, right? This is not a drill, right? The issues that many of you care about right now are issues that are going to affect the future of this country. And many of us have very strong views about what will work and not work in the coming years. So stay committed to your convictions. Don't water them down. And also, I sometimes get labeled a centrist or a moderate. I don't like those terms. I don't at all consider myself a centrist or a moderate, because that sounds to me like we're picking the two extremes of a particular issue and just going to the midpoint, which very few people actually do. But there is something close to that description, which I think describes a posture, and the people with whom I work best are similarly postured. We might have very significant differences, polar opposite views of an issue, but we have a temperament that says, we're going to have a discussion, I'm going to respect you as a human being, we're going to play by some rules of the game. Now, I also spent a lot of the rest of my life writing and advising about protests, so I'm not, you can over civility the thing. Sometimes you need protest, sometimes you need destabilization, sometimes you need to disrupt. But in many ordinary contexts, there's a real value in those modes of and temperament of how you disagree. And I think to the extent that in the law school environment especially, we can model this and pull this off, we're going to produce far better lawyers. I have a couple, this isn't like a tell-all book or anything, but I do draw on lots of true stories, including times when I've been protested or awkward moments in my legal teaching career. And in the midst of those moments, one of my greatest goals and concerns as an educator, especially when it involves a group of law students protesting, is yes, I want you to care about your issues, I want you to have passion, I want you to fight for your cause, but I also want you to be a lawyer, right? And think about, in the midst of whatever you're doing, what's the lawyerly possibility here, what's the lawyerly way of arguing, what's the lawyerly outcome? And sometimes just asking those questions can bound your form of engagement. Again, it doesn't mean don't protest, it doesn't mean give up or surrender to the powers, but it does mean use the training that you're given to be lawyerly. And I also teach undergraduates who don't yet have that skill set, and so I have to sort of back up a bit and say, well, let's imagine a longer term strategy here, and sometimes that works as well.
I do have a question. When I was reading the chapter on the line between wrong and evil, I felt like some things came to mind, and one thing specifically is the conversations that are currently happening about Israel and Palestine. Obviously, it's on the forefront of many of our minds. And my question over here is, what do we do when certain, maybe principled opinions that we have are not only suppressed, but sometimes even criminalized, to the point where we don't even have that space to disagree or speak about our own opinions? Yeah.
I mean, what a great sort of very live issue that is certainly active right now. I think that it's important. I mean, there are lots of ways to comment on it. I'm just going to take a small slice of this, but within the context of the university setting, I think it's really important to advocate for all voices being heard. To a point. Now, the law sets some pretty clear limits about imminent threats of violence and that sort of thing. But also, all voices being heard doesn't give you the answer of how you engage. So you can have very strong political and other convictions about, for example, the current situation in the Middle East, and you can engage in those, but I think two things have to happen in the conversation to be a conversation and not a performance or a fight. So one of those things is you have to be committed to hearing what's being said without reflexively getting into an indignant or reflexive defensive posture, right? Especially, if what's being said offends you, to respond with, that doesn't make me feel safe. But I mean, it's a really important line, especially in an academic setting, to say, no, I need to hear things, even if I feel extremely uncomfortable with what you're saying. I don't need to hear them in my apartment, right? You're not free to come over there and just berate me. I don't need to hear them in the middle of dinner out with friends, but in an educational environment, I need to hear them, and they are going to make me uncomfortable. And maybe the fact that you said them, and that I have to be continuing to be your neighbor and your classmate, that's also going to make me uncomfortable. But it's not threatening my physical safety in most cases. And then in the other direction, there needs to be, especially with an issue this complex that's not going away, a kind of generosity in conversation that says, I'm not going to change my mind about this issue, but I am with these people for a period of years in a shared environment, and if I just throw bombs the whole time, that's not going to win me any friends. It's also going to be a very ineffective way to try to persuade other people. So if we can, it's a great case study, but the principle is generalizable. If that's the way that we can engage across some of these ideas, the better off we're going to be. And again, I'll say here, if we can't pull this off as lawyers in training, and for those of you who are not in law, you're one of the best institutions in the world, learning how to think, reason, argue, train yourself to be better, to support the things you care about. If you can't do that effectively here, then where else in life are you going to get that? Or where would you expect other people to be doing it better? So I think, embrace the opportunity of this place and be excited for practicing.
once in a while, my large looming presence comes in handy. So we have about 10 minutes to open this up for Q&A from the audience. Is that okay? All of you? So what questions do people have? What would you like to talk about? Yes.
Yeah, I think the talk's been really interesting. The issue we have today is that when we come to disagreements, the underlying set of facts are usually disagreements rather than the values and principles that underlie people's perceptions of those facts. So for instance, somebody says, well, climate change is a hoax. We fundamentally disagree on the facts of what we're talking about, not the values and principles you have going into that question. So where do you go with that? How do we bridge the divides when we can't even agree on what is factually correct or incorrect?
Yeah, it's a huge and growing question in society today, and I think especially if you are a lawyer, if you have a public voice, if you're in a position where people are listening to you, the key here is to qualify your claims appropriately and recognize when your own positions are no longer facts but a normative commitment. Because if you don't do that, then the other side, you can picture your other side that is sort of post-fact. The other side is going to point to every instance where you're falling into the same trap and then just say, like, look, we're all just making it up, right? And that's an incredibly rhetorically powerful tool you're giving to that other side. So are there facts that we can and should all agree upon? Is today Wednesday? Is today Wednesday? Is today Wednesday, right? That's a fact, and if you're going to challenge me on that, we've got a real problem about basic epistemology and understanding of the world. Was the Austin COVID policy following science? It's not a fact. It's a judgment that incorporates science and law and policy preferences and all kinds of other things. Was the homicide self-defense? Also not a fact, right? We know a very complicated mix of fact and law and human judgment, and sometimes human judgment that gets it wrong, which even furthers our introduction to facts of the world. So I think one of the things that law teaches you is how much of the world, especially messy human interactions, are more than facts, and they're complicated situations with some factual grounding and also lots of norms and also lots of judgments. That, by the way, is also the classroom, right? Nobody is teaching you anything objectively, right? We are all non-neutral actors, and the best teachers are going to do their best to recognize their biases and teach you different positions and different angles, but no one's teaching you just the facts of history, for example. So there's I think the first answer is there's a posture of recognizing our own limits when it comes to claiming and describing facts of the world. But then the second point is, and this is increasingly critical, when you're beyond the norms and the complex issues, and we're talking and debating about whether today is Wednesday, be alert and be worried about that, because that's a pretty fundamental break from reality, and that's happening more and more. And maybe at that point the answer is not to argue whether it's Wednesday, because you're not going to win that on a rational cognitive dimension. Maybe it's to press in and ask what else is going on in that person's life.
Can I weigh in on something with this as well? From the perspective of the book, I don't know that I would call this a criticism so much as a limitation of the scope of the book, is that it's not necessarily about how do you deal with somebody who fundamentally won't accept your fact premise. It's more about how do you deal with people who are engaging in good faith even though they may disagree with your fact premise or even though they may disagree with your beliefs. And I don't think you would have, at least I didn't read anything in the book about simply walking away when something becomes like factually, you are unable to factually agree on a place to even begin the conversation, as much as it is a book about how do you have that conversation once you are in a place to begin to have it.
Yeah, I do. There are a couple instances where I describe walking away, but it's usually because I'm distracted by food and not because I'm making a principled exit. But it's a great point. Learning modes of disagreement. For some people, it means being more courageous and having more conversations. For other people, it's having fewer conversations or walking away from some conversations. And I think and then if you're to that kind of, we disagree about the facts point and someone you care about, then you really have to settle in for the long game, right? I mean, if your goal is to get Uncle Tim, who doesn't think today is Wednesday, to change his presidential vote by November, it's not going to happen, right? So slow down, ask what does this relationship mean to me, and how can I work on trust building and communication for the next few years, not just the next few months.
Good time for one or two more.
I'm fascinated by your point about the kumbaya moment of the 90s. And you, I think, were talking about it more in terms of religious pluralism. I'm thinking about it more in terms of like racial pluralism. I think that a reality of that, maybe this is what you're getting at, is that we weren't actually grappling with racial realities. And I don't know that our country really was until maybe the past 4 or 5 years. And that has been tumultuous. I think, to put it simply, tumultuous for our country. But I take your point to be that that's actually a good thing. I mean, that, the discussions that we're having about racial realities are hopefully going to lead us to a better place in terms of engaging in those sorts of conversations. My question is, if you were to take, having written this book and studied this, go back to the 90s, time machine, and if you could direct how those conversations, or how this progress has unfolded in our country, I think my question is, are those growing pains necessary, or was there a different path that we could have taken, and what would that path have looked like, or how would you direct that path if you could?
Yeah, it's a great question. Super complicated and lots to think about there. I suppose one point is that when we look at past eras of this country, they've been far more disruptive than the last 5 years. I mean, around race and lots of other issues, but the 60s were more disruptive, the 20s were more disruptive when it came to labor unrest, certainly the Civil War and other examples. So we've had large periods of disruption and instability, and sometimes they've led to very productive change and progress, and sometimes they haven't. And sometimes, I'm actually not sure about how significant the last 5 years, for example, will be 10 or 15 years from now, because there's a lot of performative rhetoric that has not been met with action and institution building. And when it comes to something like issues of racial inequity, that's going to just take a lot more political willpower and otherwise. I do think one of the chapters I get into toward the end of the book is that each chapter is titled with a question, and I mean it as a question, and to have you, the reader, try to answer it for yourself. But one of them is forgiveness possible? And I try to describe what the political and personal concept of forgiveness is. But one of the things about forgiveness that people often conflate in public discourse is that if the goal, politically and otherwise, is reconciliation, as in we recognize these wrongs, and by the way, another great thing the law teaches you, as you know, is you're not going to, when there's an injustice in the world, you don't fix it with justice, right? The best we can do is proximate justice. Injustices are perpetual, and wrongs are never fully remedied. So we live in a world with unfulfilled injustice, and we do our best in law and elsewhere to bring proximate justice, with sometimes the goal of reconciliation. Forgiveness can lead to reconciliation, but in order to do that, it requires a matching of repentance. And then we can have a complicated discussion of what does repentance look like in the context of something like racial equity. One of the reasons that the long-term political effort toward truth and reconciliation in South Africa was less successful than people had initially hoped was that despite these tremendous acts of forgiveness on one hand, there was no significant match of repentance, which meant that reconciliation, especially as a political goal, couldn't happen. So part of this is to say that the instability, the discussions are good, but they're only kind of a first action, and with something as complicated and long-standing as issues of race and difference related to race, we're going to need to see a lot more, I think, going forward.
Okay, everyone. One more time, thank you all for coming. I'll make one last push. Go buy the book.